Hello, I'm John Nordlinger, and I'm very pleased to announce Marilee and Mayo from the National Academies here to speak. I met Marilee for the first time a year and a half ago, where she got up on stage at an event Microsoft was putting on, and she said basically that given the popularity of gaming and the unpopularity of stringent education is the way one can benefit from the other. And given her position as a director with the National Academies, I thought this was a very nice person to come here and tell us the same powerful message as we embark on our own efforts. So let's welcome Marilee and Mayo. And also, let me remind people to turn off their cell phones. And folks that are watching remotely, thank you very much for attending. And Marilee Mayo.
Thank you. Let me see, is this microphone working yet? Oh, yes, good. I am extremely pleased to see all of you who got rid of your other meetings so you could attend this talk. And the title of my talk is a little unusual, but I'll explain it as I go along. Let me say a little bit about the National Academies. This is a rebranding of some things you may be more familiar with as the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, Institute of Medicine, and National Research Council. So a while ago they decided they need some umbrella name to cover all those, and that's what the National Academies is. And I run a small unit within the National Academies that brings together the heads of the federal funding agencies, their senior-most staff, some industry CEOs, some VPs of research, some university presidents, some VPs of research from universities, and they come together and talk about issues that affect the research enterprise in the United States. And a long-standing concern of theirs has been the science and engineering workforce. And so my interest in this area comes from that vantage point, although I have to say that almost everything I say about the game space is mine and not the Academies, because the Academies isn't really into this space yet. They are considering whether to get into this area, and I'm hopeful that, particularly if Microsoft takes some steps to show industry's involvement, that that will trigger a number of organizations, including my own, to say that this is something we definitely ought to be doing more in. And I'm hopeful that, particularly if Microsoft takes some steps to show industry's involvement, that that will trigger a number of organizations, including my own, to say that this is something we definitely ought to be doing more in. And I'm hopeful that, particularly if Microsoft takes some steps to show industry's involvement, that that will trigger a number of organizations, including my own, to say that this is something we definitely ought to be doing more in.
A year and a half ago,
So, without further ado, let me first ask whether any of you have read the book Ender's Game. Yay! Almost everybody. One of my favorite stories. It started off as a short story in 1977, became a novel in 1985, and the premise of the story is that there is an era in the far future where we, Earth, are at war with an alien race, And in order to train ever younger people to combat the aliens and learn military tactics, video games are used as a training mechanism. So you go to battle school and you do video game after video game after video game, and finally you become good enough that you graduate and go off into real battles. And Ender, the main character of the book, is sufficiently good that they keep giving him more and more complicated, more and more difficult video games. And in the end, he masters one where his brilliant tactics completely annihilate the alien fleet. And only afterwards does he discover that, in fact, he was commanding real battleships in real battle, and he has committed genocide of an entire alien race. So a very sobering story, but I use it in the title of this talk because it is also the first example of a written account or an imagining that video games could be used to train for educational purposes, to do something other than entertain, and to do so realistically and so perfectly that you could actually immediately translate that information to a work situation. So that's the subject area of the serious game space, which is also the space I'll be talking about. Now, coming back to my roots within the National Academies, we're very interested in the whole issue of international competitiveness and what the U.S. is going to look like in many years as countries around the world begin to invest more in science and engineering, begin to train more and more of their people. And there are several things that are becoming fairly apparent. One is that in the past, we had been relying on the fact that we were sort of the sole producer, at least the dominant producer of scientists and engineers, and that was why a lot of science and engineering resided in this country, because we had most of the people who did that. That is not going to be in the case in the future. We have only 5% of the world's population, so if everything evens out in the end and we're all on sort of the same playing field, we'll probably only have about 5% of the world's scientists and engineers, and we won't simply have everything happening here because we're the only place that has the right people. What is actually even more interesting is that if you assume that intelligent people are sprinkled evenly around the world, so that we're all part of the same bell curve population, then a small version of this bell curve, the United States population of scientists and engineers, will kind of look like this, and a large country or a populous country such as China or India will have a sort of intelligence bell curve like this. Same equation, but they got more people, so it's bigger. But also, you can see that it extends out further. Now, theoretically, this also extends out, but at some point it reaches like a quarter of a person, which isn't a real person, whereas a large country such as China and India, they won't have a quarter of an Einstein, they'll have a real Einstein. And so we will not only have fewer people, but statistically speaking, the smartest smart people will probably be mostly elsewhere. And unlike in the past, we can't just assume that they're going to come to this country because our country is the only place that gives them an opportunity to expand their horizons, get a good education, and have a meaningful career. So we've gone from being the only game in town to probably a pretty small part of the global game. And we're in that transition right now. We haven't faced the issue before because before there wasn't enough science and engineering education infrastructure in other countries for us to really worry about or to even think about. Now it's growing and growing rapidly. I'll show you some statistics on that. And it's led to a lot of events that have caused a lot of heartache for some people, certainly angst in policy circles, offshoring, outsourcing. When I first started giving this talk, which must have been 2 or 3 years ago, these were entirely new concepts. You have no idea how panicked people were. Now I think we're getting used to it, but still it will be a sea change for my children as opposed to my career. And the thing that is most concerning to people in policy circles is that not that so much other countries are doing better and better. In the overall scheme of things, that's probably good, but that the U.S. has been so dominant for so long, it doesn't know how to move anymore. You'll see all these statistics where we're basically stagnant. And if you're stagnant in an era where everybody else is climbing, eventually you find yourself at the bottom. So we're losing ground in a number of areas by virtue of remaining still, and one of those is the production of bachelor students in science and engineering. So you could, so already China is certainly producing more than we are. If you look at just engineering, we've slid even further down, and in fact, we are very well poised to lose most engineering fairly soon. And some engineering disciplines like metallurgy went overseas a couple of decades ago. So there's a lot to be concerned about there. We look like we're in better shape at the PhD level. You know, look, we're #1 here and #1 here, but 50% of those students actually come from other countries and just obtain their degrees here. And in fact, if you were to take the Chinese students at U.S. universities and combine them with the Chinese students at Chinese universities obtaining PhDs, you would find that the Chinese PhD production rate was about twice the U.S. production rate. Yes?
I don't understand the metrics. These are degrees produced within a country, not citizenship or anything?
Yes, these are degrees produced within a country. It's very difficult. I can kind of make some estimates, but I didn't want to show them because if they get reproduced, they're my personal estimates. But I could take these, and that's what I was saying down here. Half of these, or actually more correctly, half of these I know are Asian. Okay, so if you redistribute those, plus for some countries I can tell you what the country of origin was, but not all countries keep that data. So you can't actually develop a really good pie chart of where the citizens came from as well as you can where they got their degrees, just because of the way the governments collect the data. Yes?
So, but it seems like what matters is not where the people are educated, but where they end up after they get educated. So. Yeah,
and we'll go into that in a minute, but it turns out that where people are educated dictates where industry then starts putting its activities, such as its R&D facilities, which then drives sort of the next round. So it tends to be sort of a circle, and we'll start looking at some of those statistics too. But you're right. The first round doesn't so bad. It's just when things start building on each other, and the smart people turn out to drive most, for example, corporate R&D relocation decisions. This is what I was saying about being fairly stagnant. Here are the U.S. production of PhDs, and it really hasn't changed a lot in the last 25 years. Really pretty stagnant. Overall, we've grown, but all of this growth has pretty much been in foreign students coming here to study. And there was a dip sort of around the 9/11 era, and that recovered. This is for computer science. I know a lot of you are computer scientists, so I thought I'd throw this chart in showing of all those obtaining PhDs at U.S. universities, how many are U.S. citizens, how many are temporary residents. In contrast to our fairly stagnant production of PhDs, we have a significant growth in the Asian countries. China is almost a miracle story. You look at where they were 20 years ago, and they were producing almost no PhDs, sort of single-digit PhDs. Now 7,000 or 8,000 a year. And the growth has just been phenomenal. There's no sign of stopping. This is a huge government imperative to try to increase not only the quantity of PhDs, but they're very concerned now about the quality and making sure they have metrics that say that their PhDs are as good as the ones being produced in Western European and U.S. countries. We also see growth in other Asian countries, South Korea, Taiwan, and India. What's interesting about the U.S. is that we actually educate a wide swath of our population. We probably educate more sort of 18 to 24-year-olds as a fraction of the total population with college degrees than any other country. But out of that total population going to college, a very, very small fraction ends up getting science and engineering degrees. So if I think of the university system as having some sort of production efficiency in terms of number of students in, number of scientists and engineers out over number of students in, it turns out that we rank 80th out of about 92 countries in that metric. So we have a very small production rate given the input of people that we have. And part of this is sort of a national priority. We don't force our students to choose any particular major. Some countries do. They have only so many slots for things that aren't science and engineering. Some of this is that we haven't really had to worry about producing we haven't been in this economic competitiveness issue, facing economic competitiveness issues like we have recently, so we haven't really pressured anyone to do anything about the problem. But the fact is that our university system is very inefficient at producing scientists and engineers. Many people attribute this, and I would say college professors are the worst at passing on the blame, but they attribute to this to poor K-12 education. And those of you who follow well, started as a third international math and science study, now it's I think the international math and science studies, will recall that we started off kind of doing okay in about fourth grade compared to other countries. I took 2003 data where we were 12th in the world in math, 6th in the world in science. By the time you got to 8th grade, our students were 14th in the world in math, 9th in the world in science, and then by the time you get to 12th grade, We're now 24th in the world in math, 22nd in the world in science. And this sort of depressing litany of data caused one legislator to remark, you know, I think ours is the only school system where the longer you stay in, the worse off you are. And so there's something very wrong with that picture. So people are constantly looking for a silver bullet to our science and engineering education woes. How do we fix this problem? How do we get more students interested in science and engineering? How do we make the quality of their education better? And the fact of the matter is that there's no silver bullet. There have been thousands of recommendations ranging from higher pay for science and math teachers to scholarships for students to let's get the textbook publishers out of the game, let's get rid of No Child Left Behind. I mean, 1,000 recommendations out there. None of them really has the capacity to drive change on the national scale that we need. And games won't either, but they come a lot closer, I think, than a lot of other interventions one could think of. And there's some good reasons to look at games as a potential way for educating students or even non-students in science and engineering. One of those reasons is that they don't have to go through the school system to have an impact. We have so many demands on our school systems today. Well, first of all, we have tens of thousands of school districts, and unlike having a national education system, so any change you want to make has to be repeated about 10,000 times. So that's a problem in itself. But the teachers have so many demands on their time. They have to meet No Child Left Behind standards. They have all these things they have to cram into a day. And the last thing they really need is something else loaded on top of that. And so most education interventions fail because it's very difficult to actually go through the school system. Yes? Were you bidding on the auctioned item there? But games, people play in their spare time. They play them on their mobile phones. They play them at home. They play them in after-school care. I mean, you really don't have to use the school system as a vector to get this stuff to the kids if you go the game route. Also, games have the ability to tailor a learning experience. They're software. You can load it full of if-then statements. If, a student achieves this little quest, then they're permitted to go on this other quest. If not, do this quest over here that will reinforce the learning objective they missed the first time. And so you can design these things to provide an individualized learning experience for the student, which is not possible in a classroom situation where you have to lecture to everybody in lockstep. And for those of you who have children and have spent time trying to get your kid into the classroom with the best teacher, you realize that the quality of teacher does make a significant difference, that quality varies quite a lot. And software, for better or for worse, tends to be a fairly uniform quality. Once you stamp out those CDs, it's pretty much the same product that goes from person to person. And so you have the opportunity, if you could do it well, to get a really high quality product in the hands of someone who might not have a good teacher. So there's some good reasons to think that games might be a potential solution to some of our science and engineering training problems. But there are some reasons I think are great reasons. The foremost among them is the sheer scalability of games. A single game, and I'll show you the data in a minute, can reach more people easily than the entire higher education system in the United States. A single game. Tremendous scalability. If you think of a nation filled with individual lecture halls and individual professors or individual teachers, that is a lot of resources being devoted to the same exercise in parallel many, many, many times. And even then you don't reach everybody and reach them well. There's tremendous scalability to this medium. So you could reach a lot of people, but then the question is, once you've reached those people, are you delivering them a learning experience that's any better than what they would get in the traditional classroom? I mean, the whole reason for the traditional classroom, you think, is because that's the best way to get the material. It turns out that actually a lot of studies have been done on transmitting information, and that the lecture format in particular is about the worst method there is. I mean, scientifically proven the worst method for delivering information. The reason it's persisted so long is it's economically viable. I mean, especially, if you've ever been to an introductory college, say, chemistry class, hundreds of people in the auditorium, one professor's salary to lecture those guys, especially if the guy lectures a couple of auditoriums full of people a day, there's a great economy of scale there. But it is not, from a learning science point of view, a good approach.
So the title of this slide is that it's a bronze bullet. Is this, do you mean winning the...
I'm sorry, I forgot to say. So it's not a silver bullet to the science and engineering education problem, but it could be a bronze bullet. So like a little notch lower. There are a lot of things you could do that could help.
So you're not no longer talking about the brain war that you mentioned in the beginning.
Well, I'm talking about getting a solution to the education problem, particularly in science and engineering, that then might produce more brains in this country than we would produce if we didn't fix our education system.
But they have it too.
Oh, yeah.
Chinese and Indians, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, everybody wants to educate their people, you know, to sort of the next level. And of course, the question is, if you produce a game that, say, teaches chemistry so perfectly that that makes you, then everybody has access to it. But I will say this: if we are 24th on the scale of countries that know chemistry, okay, and China and India, and, you know, they're like, you know, 3rd through 7th, then we have a lot more to gain than the countries that are already doing well. So it is true, it is an equalizer. Once you get it out there, everybody would benefit, but I think we have a greater delta to overcome. Yeah.
But on the other hand, for higher level education, U.S. is still number 1. There's no doubt about it. I wonder whether you have any comment.
The U.S. higher education system is still seen as the best in the world by most people. It's also very clear that the gap is narrowing very fast, okay? And that the rate of preparation in the lower grades and undergraduate education is not sufficient to overcome, to make a difference that would keep that gap, that would allow that gap to persist. So that gap is just narrowing very fast. But you're right, we're still ahead, it's just narrowing very fast. And mostly we're doing very well because most of those people got educated somewhere else and then came here to get that little finishing touch. So they didn't have all the problems with not understanding the fundamentals that most of our students have. So, so games have the capability of reaching lots and lots of people, which is fabulous. But it also turns out that they teach better than lectures. And there's several reasons for this. One is, if you look into learning science, there are theoretical considerations that would tell you this is so. And I'm hoping there are not some real learning science experts here, because I'm going to badly paraphrase what that field has to say, Jamie. There are also some biochemical reasons why games teach better than lectures. And of course, if you spend a lot of time on anything, as people tend to spend a lot of time on games, you would expect that even if the instructional paradigm is no better or no worse, you would still do better just by having spent twice as much time with the material. So time on task is an issue. And I would like to, in the sort of second half of this talk, give some experimental proof, some studies that have been done that show these facts to be true. The first issue, the sheer scalability of games. Many of you will be familiar with the sort of blockbuster World of Warcraft. These data are about a year old, so now I think it's up around 8 million people playing it. But compare that to the entire production of science and engineering students, you know, in the U.S., all colleges and all universities, all scientific disciplines, which is about 390,000. And it's not just World of Warcraft. Most of these games, you know, several of these more popular games, well, these are Korean, but you get the idea. They can reach lots of people, and lots of people are playing them. Oops, sorry. This is some of the going down in scale in terms of less popular games. Still, we're seeing a lot of games there where one game is reaching a lot of people. I didn't even use like CD-ROM based games or Xbox games. Those numbers are huge as well. These are just massive multiplayer online games. And I use these data because there are fairly solid data over a good time series. So it had to do with the quality of the data as opposed to saying that these games are particularly the best that are out there. And if we take a look at something like engineering, okay, so these are all the chemical, mechanical, electrical, civil, you know, every single kind of engineers. Only 60,000 a year, almost every game out there. I mean, it only has to be half good before it reaches that many people. So it is a truly scalable medium. And from learning theory, we would expect that these games can teach better than the conventional lecture. After the U.S. did so poorly on several of these international tests, a fair amount of money was spent to determine why. And so there are studies after study after study, and they all came back with variations on the same conclusion that U.S. students in class tended to cover a lot of topics. So, you know, in math you would cover 16 different things, but you wouldn't cover any of them in enough depth to really learn it or to understand how to apply it or to extrapolate it to real life. And this was true of science in particular, Part of that problem was in turn related to the fact that many of the people teaching science or math were not themselves trained in science or math. And so not knowing anything about the subject, the best they could do is read from the textbook. So they read the first paragraph from each chapter, and that would be the science lesson. And in fact, we'll get some data later showing that the single most common training for math teachers in K-12 is physical education. That's their major. So, and in fact, I was taught physics by a guy who was hired to be the basketball coach, but then the basketball team didn't do very well, so they assigned him to teach physics. And that's fairly common in the United States. Okay, so when you have a bunch of people who don't really understand what they're teaching and the textbook is a salvation, reading from the textbook becomes the main source of instruction, and the depth of understanding by the students becomes fairly limited. Games, however, have the chance to give a much deeper learning experience. For one thing, they're not simply talking at you, they're experiential in nature. If there's a sort of a segment of the learning theory community that believes that if you do it, you learn it much better. So if you engage in the process of fixing a car, you understand car mechanics a lot better than if you simply read about it. And in games, you do things. You have active participation. The science and engineering community is very fond of the phrase inquiry-based learning, which means I'll ask myself, ooh, what would happen if I do this? And then I'll do it and see what happens. What happens if I do this? This internal question and answer type of mode is supposed to be extremely helpful to deepening your learning. There's another concept called authenticity. This one is a little different than what it sounds like. It sounds like, gee, if I make a game where everything looks perfectly like, say, this auditorium and everything is visually like it is in real life, then people will learn better. That's not it. The concept of authenticity is if when playing a game or having any learning experience, the decision-making process your brain goes through is the same decision-making process that you would have to go through in real life, then that transfers very easily. And so if you can construct a game where the situation you're involved in, the decisions you have to make are similar to real life, then you can see a very solid information transfer. Another point, and there's just three more on the next slide, is that there is a fair amount of evidence that shows that self-efficacy is important. If you believe in your heart of hearts that you can do something, then you will keep trying until you do it, basically. If you're pretty sure that you can't do it, you'll give up after a couple of tries and go on and do something else. And of course, your success is linked in part to how often you try. And so people who believe that they can eventually do it will eventually do it more often than not, just because they try harder and longer. And what games do, by virtue of all the rewards and the levels and all of the positive feedback you get every time you do anything even mildly significant, is they say, yeah, you just did it, you just did it, you just did it. So it's reward after reward after reward, and you think, I can do this because I just did it, and I'll do it again. I did level 20, I can surely do level 21. And lectures don't really have that possibility. You know, every time a little light bulb goes on in a quiet student's head, you're not saying, yeah, you got it. It just can't happen in that kind of a mass environment. One thing that distinguishes games from simulations, and there's certainly an entire era in which everybody thought simulations would save science and engineering education. In fact, they do have a lot to offer. But a key difference between games and simulations is that games have goals and simulations are open-ended. So simulations is there, you can kind of move things around and interact with it, but there's no purpose in your doing it really. Okay, a game, you've got to do all these things in order to build the spaceship or kill the bad guy or whatever. So games have goals. And it turns out that having a goal does drive your personal learning at an accelerated rate because you feel like you have a reason to be learning this material. Another attribute of games is that they have very fast and very continuous feedback with the player/user. And this is a key problem with lectures. A typical student in a high school classroom will get to ask normally about 0.11 questions per hour. Okay, so a lot of information is coming, but very little check back is coming back at the other end to the teacher. One breakthrough in this area has been adaptive learning software that is a software tutor. And in that case, in the case, for example, the Carnegie Mellon Algebra Tutor, you're constantly interacting with the software tutor, and you can get in the equivalent of 20 to 30 questions per hour, seeing if you did it right, checking, seeing if you did it right, checking. And that kind of approach seems to augment these international science scores by about 30%. Now, to give you some idea of what that means, we were kind of like near the bottom of the pack of international countries in science and engineering by the time you got to high school and those test scores, a 30% increase would put us way at the top. Okay, so this is a significant improvement and can be and has been exhibited by tutor software. And the question is, if one were to do the same type of thing in a game format, would you get equivalent results because you have the same kind of feedback mechanisms? But this hasn't really been done in a game yet. And then finally, games have the opportunity for cooperative learning. It turns out that solo learning, which is typical student sitting there trying to do his homework by himself, is a pretty inefficient way to learn things. And if you, even in a classroom, just get students in small teams and ask them to do an assignment together, the students will learn more because they ask questions of each other. They get a lot of feedback. They expand their understanding by their peers as well as just looking at the material themselves. And that improvement is about a 50% improvement in learning that occurs by using a cooperative mechanism for problem solving as opposed to a solo mechanism for problem solving. So games, if they are designed to be cooperative games where a bunch of you go off on a quest, say, have the capability of increasing learning simply by going into the cooperative mode as opposed to leaving people stranded in solo mode where if they get confused they have nowhere to turn. So there are a bunch of reasons from learning theory that suggest games should be a powerful learning mechanism. But one of the most interesting aspects of games, I think, and Ben's probably, I see him here, he's probably going to shoot me down when I talk about this, but there are some interesting biochemical reasons. This is sort of a sensitive issue because people will say, oh, the same biochemistry will drive people to murder other people, but I don't think that's the way. I'll explain what I think the difference is between what people claim in the newspapers and what I think is actually happening. But there are biochemical changes that happen in the brain when you play games, and it turns out these biochemical changes are in fact the precursors to the memory storage event. So that what you learn while playing a game is actually more easily cemented in your brain than things you learn during the lecture. And let me explain how this works. So over millennia of evolution, the human race has had to adapt to conditions in which we are constantly bombarded with information. Looking at all the seats in this auditorium, how many people are sitting in the seats, what they're doing. I mean, lots and lots of information, most of which I will not need to know tomorrow. Okay? So how does your brain decide what information to keep and what information to discard when you're bombarded with sensory information all the time? Well, it developed a fairly basic principle, and it goes something like this. If the piece of information coming at me has emotional content. It makes me angry, it makes me sad, it makes me happy, it makes me joyous, it does something to me emotionally, then probably it was important. So finding out my parents are getting a divorce, long-term memory storage, okay? It creates chemical events that lead to long-term memory storage. You know, my boyfriend broke up with me, I got an A on the exam, all those things that create emotion will get retained. Things like sitting in the 10 a.m. lecture class, you know, stuff is going over you like this, not a lot of emotional content does not get stored. So the brain actually takes a look at the emotional content. If it causes an emotional reaction, dopamine is released in the amygdala. That turns out to be the chemical precursor to a memory storage event that leads to long-term memory. And there's a wonderful quote from the Learning Laboratory in Denmark which explains this rather well, so I'll read it. The fact is that we are not even masters of our own conscious memory. What we remember and what we do not is subject to an emotional control which follows a simple principle. If a given impression has emotional meaning, we learn it. If it does not trigger an emotional response, it is not learned. In this case, the amygdala works as a kind of emotiometer which regulates hippocampus and conscious learning. This serves a purpose to economize the resources with regard to what to learn. So, if you want someone to remember what you say, make sure that it has emotional meaning for the person who has to remember this. So right now is whether I should jump up and down and slap someone across the face and throw you against the wall because you'll remember it, okay? If I don't do that, there's a good chance by tomorrow this will all have drained out of your brain. So in my personal life, the way I realized this was true is, I mean, I was always a pretty good student, but for the most part, I didn't really learn a lot sitting in the lectures. What I learned is the night before the exam when I was trying to cram it all in. And I finally realized that it was the fear of failing the final exam that actually got me to learn the material. And without that fear, without the chemical changes in my brain that fear produced, it was literally biochemically impossible for me to learn that material. And what got me through school is a heightened state of fear. for even small events like quizzes, and that's probably why, I didn't actually have to fail the class before I had enough motivation to actually, learn the material. But that's why it's very difficult to learn anything until the fear of the final exam is upon you. So there is at least one study I know of, and this was published in Nature, which is not a shoddy journal, that demonstrates or that measures the level of dopamine in the brain. Actually, it sort of does so indirectly, but it measures dopamine level in the brain of people playing video games. And it shows that as you play the game, the dopamine level goes up, actually sort of kind of linearly, ultimately reaching about a factor of 2 of what it would be in the rest state. And in fact, the gamer's performance goes up linearly with that. So that it's a lockstep combination of the dopamine level and then your ability to learn the tasks that you're being asked to do during the video game. And so ultimately, it's about a factor of 2 improvement over the non-players, what you're able to achieve. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
That last point, you're saying that people that play games have greater opportunity to reach dopamine outside of playing games or is that just playing games?
No, that's during the playing of the game. The concept here is that during the gameplay, you're sort of drenching your brain in dopamine, and that sort of activated state allows you to store information much more readily than if you didn't have that state. But once it's encoded, it's encoded. You'll remember it after that too. So sort of back to the video game violence thing, I personally don't think video games cause anyone to go out and shoot anyone, but if you were actually trying to train someone to do something, anything, you would remember how to do it better if you had learned it in a video game than if somebody had simply talked to you about it. So, and that goes to military training, it goes to learning chemistry, it goes to a lot of things. Okay, and then finally, even if there were no reason to consider video games as a superior learning vehicle, the sheer fact that people spend a lot of time on them has certainly got us to account for something. And in fact, data varies, but at least one source would say that the average time spent by teenagers in video game play is about 5 to 8 hours a week, which turns out to be about how much time college-bound seniors are spending on their homework. So you could approximately double the time that students are exposed to academic material if it were in video game form and if it were compelling enough to play. So that begs the question, okay, if you put academic game material in a video game form, is it compelling enough for anyone to want to play it? Well, in some sense, the really great existence proof is not out there yet in terms of a game that's sort of out there on the market that teaches something really hard like, I don't know, statics, and people are flocking to play it and paying big bucks for it. That hasn't happened yet. The field's really new, and it's a huge challenge to make something that's both engaging and pedagogically correct. But there are data to suggest that the game doesn't have to be all about killing dwarves and trolls in order for people to get engaged in it and want to keep playing it. So here's a game that was developed by Brianna Collar at Northern Illinois University. It's actually a racing car game, and he uses it to teach numerical methods. Okay, so this is an advanced math class, not your most exciting material from a layman's perspective. And in the class, actually the class is divided in 2 parts. One part of the class did the regular lectures plus sort of homework out of the textbook. The other part of the class spent their time designing, refining, and playing this video game where they used their numerical methods to set the velocity, acceleration, and steering algorithms for the car. So the idea was the car should be able to go faster and faster around the track until your car could beat the other guy's car because your numerical methods were better than the other guy's numerical methods. Students who took the video game portion of the course spent about twice as much time doing their homework. It was not a reduction in the time spent in the class. And in fact, this is what I was saying earlier, that maybe you could expect about twice as much time being spent doing academic stuff if it was in a game format. And what was really interesting is they not only spent twice as much time doing it, but they loved doing it. 80% of the class went on for advanced numerical methods, which, believe me, was not a big seller, okay, up to this point. So people will spend a lot of time because of the feedback and because of the engagement working on the same issues in video game format than they would have otherwise.
Do you know what fraction of the class took the advanced numerical methods who were in the control group?
I would have to ask because I don't remember, but my guess is somewhere between my guess is around a quarter of that, but I couldn't swear to it. Actually, I think what sort of happened was before this class, they didn't even have an advanced one, and so many people wanted to do it that they created one. But I could be wrong. But they did have the non-game playing and game playing versions, and I should have asked that. And I can if you want to know. Okay, another example of how games not only engage people but result in superior learning outcomes comes from the North Dakota State University group, which developed two games, one to teach Introduction to Geology and one to teach Introduction to Cell Biology. So these are two intro courses, and they divided their class into three groups. So there's the game playing section, there was the non-game playing lecture only section. Everybody got lectures, but one section didn't get the games. And then there was a middle section that got a web-based presentation of the same material that was in the game. So it's sort of a non-interactive, static, visual representation of a lot of the same material. So everybody got lectures. In addition, you could get nothing, a web-based presentation or game-engaged version of the classroom. What they found was that even getting the information on the web and having people have access to it there did help. In some cases, not terribly significantly, and in some cases up to 30%, just having that information visually accessible. But the games then further increase the learning outcomes to, in the case of something that wasn't statistically significant for the web-based presentation, up to 40% of an improvement in test scores, or even up to 63% in the cell biology game.
So was this decided for students, or did they get to choose?
I think they were randomly and forcibly assigned.
Yes. You might want to repeat the questions because the people want
the question was, were the students allowed to choose which section they were in, or was it chosen for them? And I believe they were randomly and forcibly assigned as part of the grant that's funded the creation of these games. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the way most of them work. So one interesting thing about this comparison between lecture, web, and game is that it shows, first of all, that anything almost is better than lecture, and secondly, it shows that the game is better than the purely visual representation of the web. So it's not just that you're looking at something, it's that you're interacting with something. So that was sort of an important conclusion. Another assessment exercise was conducted by Tabula Digita, which is the company that within the past year or so produced this algebra game Dimension. And it was a small sort of test. They did it in conjunction with the Princeton Review. And they basically took a classroom, a couple classrooms, 75 children, and did a pre-test, allowed them to play the game, and then a post-test to see how much they'd learned from playing the game from what they'd learned before. And this is all stuff they were supposed to have learned in classroom anyway, okay? So it wasn't new material to them. And those students showed an increase on average about one grade level, meaning from a C to a B or B to an A after playing this game for, I think it was 40 minutes, but on the limited subject matter that the game covered. What was very interesting, and there's a couple of other data points that suggest this might be true, is the students who performed the worst in the classroom are the ones whose grades jumped up the most after playing the game. So it was particularly effective in teaching students that were hard to reach by traditional lecture methods. Another assessment technique that I found very interesting was pioneered, at least for the serious game space, by Brianna Collar, the same guy who did the racing game. And he asked his students, the game playing and the non-game playing halves of his class, after the class was over, to draw a concept map of everything they could remember learning, over the past semester. And so the idea is you take some of the big topics you learn and you write them down, put big circles around them, then you connect them to subtopics related to those with little lines and smaller circles, and then you have more and more lines that describe things. So anything you can remember you kind of put in this web-based, web not as in World Wide Web, but web as in concept web based representation. And what he found in comparing these webs from the students who took the game playing portion of the class versus those who did just the strict lecture and homework out of the textbook was that both the game players and the non-game players really recalled the same number of sort of major topics, the main topics, and also the same number of minor topics. So if the tasks were simply to reproduce the table of contents of the textbook, those chapter headings and the main and minor topics, both sets could do that equally well. Where things began to get very interesting was when he looked at what they were able to say about those topics. Okay, so there's a Runge-Kutta method. Can you say anything about it? Did you put any little arrows off of Runge-Kutta saying what the technique is used for or how it works or what its strengths and weaknesses are? And in that case, there's a huge difference between the game players and the non-game players. And also, the number of connections between topics. So how does this numerical method compare to some other numerical method? When would you use this one as opposed to another one? That was much greater in the game players. So what you saw was that the breadth of material learned varied not at all between the game players and non-game players, but the depth of material learned varied significantly. We're going to get through these in a second, but the work of Kurt Squires, who is a fairly big name in the field, also touched on the issue of whether games produce better learning outcomes than lectures. He used a game developed at MIT called Supercharged. It was designed to teach electromagnetic forces and interactions. Actually, this is probably more of a simulation than a game. He had the same pre-test, post-test control group design. And in his case, the control group was not getting a standard lecture. It was a very interactive lecture with a highly motivated instructor. So this is your best possible scenario in a high school classroom or grade school classroom. And the control group receiving this great lecture increased their understanding by about 15%. Those who were just told, don't listen to the teacher, just play the game, increased their understanding by about 28%. And although the number of data points is too small to reach an overarching conclusion, one of the things I found really interesting about this test or the study was that in the girls, among the girls in the class, the lecture did almost absolutely nothing for them. It increased their understanding by about 5%. The games at least increased the understanding by 23%. So the girls, for some reason, were disproportionately affected. So now you have some understanding of the various sections of my title. Ender's Game, the ultimate game for teaching something. In my case, I'm interested in teaching science and engineering. Brain War, we have a struggle for generating top science and engineering talent. To do that, we have to get a better education paradigm going than the one we have. And for various reasons, theoretical, biological, time on task, we think games can do this, and there is some data to support that. What I'd like to close with are a few comments on why this is important at this point in time. We have already, as I mentioned earlier, ceded our leadership in certain areas of science and engineering to other countries. Here is some data from the realm of physics. And particularly, this is a diagram of physics publications and leading physics journals over the last, looks like about the last 20 years. And there was a time in the 1980s when the U.S. was producing about as much high-quality physics literature as the rest of the world combined. Okay? So we were, if you wanted to be in one place where most of the physics was being done, you would be here. On the other hand, you look at the data from 2004, and the U.S. is now only producing about a third of the world's output in high-quality physics literature. And so we've gone from being a dominant force to being a minority share of what's going on. And really, it's been Western Europe, largely due to a lot of European government funding of major new facilities, among other things, that has become dominant in that area. The National Academies produced a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which in the realm of the National Academies is almost a holy, this report has received almost holy status, okay? It's because some people outside of the academies have heard of it, and because it had some influence on government funding. And that report had a number of anecdotes and little data points that illustrated exactly how far we had slid by virtue of standing still, particularly in the education arena and how that relates to national competitiveness. They pointed out that most of the students studying chemistry and physics in the U.S. are taught by people who have no training in these subjects. And as I said earlier, those being taught math are mostly taught by people with PE degrees, physical education degrees. The growth in high-wage, high-tech jobs is minimal, and so we are not moving as a country towards increasingly value-added occupations. And another interesting statistic, in 2003, only 3 American companies were ranked among the top 10 recipients of patents granted by the U.S. Patent Office. So most of the action, even in U.S. patents, is now happening as a result of activities in other countries. A lot of companies are moving facilities overseas. We've seen that certainly with manufacturing, but also research centers. We're seeing a lot of research centers being established in other countries because there's a lot of good talent there. And in fact, my particular part of the Academy did a survey of some 200 multinationals, giving them a whole bunch of decision makers in multinationals, asking them why they chose to site their R&D facility in one country versus another. The leading reason was business growth opportunities. So if you're in an expanding economy like China, you want to be there because you can sell more product. But all the other reasons, like the next 2, 3, 4, and 5, all had to do with the quality of the science and engineering workforce, the interactions with the university. So that's really, we're not going to be a huge market like China. We're not going to grow at double-digit economic rates. But unless we do something about our workforce, we'll lose the one competitive edge that we really have. And we have actually, in the last decade, gone from a net exporter of high technology products to a net importer. I find serious games interesting because it has not only a lot of potential, but the field is growing according to a paradigm that many of you may have seen if you've been connected to new fields. I personally got to see when I was in sort of the nanotechnology era, so that was my life from about 1988 to 2001, and new fields emerge according to certain steps. And you can see this field grow, and you can see where it is in this step. Usually what happens is there are a couple of people who think, hey, this is kind of interesting. They gather a few of their friends. They have sort of a mini little workshop at one of their university seminar rooms. Maybe 30 people show up. And then the next thing you know, they have a couple more of these, and there are like hundreds of people there. And the Serious Games Conference, which Ben initiated, Ben sitting in the back there, started very small, but very quickly grew to this scale, which tells you this is a field that's on an upswing. Then as soon as you get a lot of people coming to conferences, the professors themselves think, gee, there is a there. Maybe I should start teaching classes in this. So you start to see classes pop up on academic campuses, and we're starting to see, it almost seems like everybody's brother start some sort of gaming-related degree or concentration, or at least a set of classes in this area. So we're sort of seeing this. Then it ceases being a niche phenomenon where specialized conferences talk about it, and it becomes a mainstream phenomenon where established societies, professional societies, start to take it up. So now we're seeing IEEE launch I'm going to get this wrong, but it's like a special section. I forget what they call. Thank you.
They wrote it.
Yeah, he would know. But at any rate, so IEEE is saying, okay, now we got to start thinking about this. How are we going to manage accreditation in this field? Okay, it's a field. When did it become a field? Well, somewhere back in here. Okay, we have to think about what our membership wants to learn about this, and continuing education and professional development. And so this is beginning to get fairly serious. And when it gets to be about this serious, then the funding agencies start saying, wow, there's a whole community out there, there's a whole field out there, why aren't we involved in this field? Okay, we should be involved. We're NSF, we have a cyber infrastructure initiative, this is part of cyber infrastructure, why aren't we doing this? And so you start to see, hopefully you will start to see, some research centers being developed as a result of the federal government getting into the game. And I'm personally hopeful that Microsoft will help stimulate this by doing one itself, because as soon as somebody does it, everybody wants to get on the bandwagon and do it themselves. So there's a cascade effect that we could look forward to. And then if the community is organized enough and big enough and passionate enough, you can get something as big as a national initiative. So the National Nanotechnology Initiative occurred right at about this stage as a result of all the academic researchers pulling together and saying, we need this, and the government responding. So we have the opportunity to do that here as well, in actually the fairly near future if we wanted it. And so this is my closing quotation. It comes from the Hart-Rundman report, which most of you will never have heard of, but it was very well known in Washington circles because it was the only report that accurately predicted September 11th, did so several months beforehand, and basically said this is going to be happening, it will be happening soon, a terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland, and we'd better establish a Department of Homeland Security to deal with it. But in addition to his prediction of moving from sort of an organized country versus country warfare to an asymmetric warfare centered in terrorism, it also said that the biggest threat was this issue of science and engineering education. The second only to a weapon of mass destruction detonating in an American city. We can think of nothing more dangerous than a failure to manage properly science, technology, and education for the common good over the next quarter century. So those were some fairly chilling words from some people who obviously had some insight on something, that this is an issue we need to care about. So that's it, and I think I've just managed to make my time. Yeah.
So how do you overcome this stereotype of criticism of playing game by the parents about, the economic problems in terms of eyesight, in terms of,
Well, my eyesight went to legally blind because of reading, and nobody complained about that.
A lot of the eyesight stuff was also CRT based too, right? And,
CRT, yeah.
And LCDs cut down on eye.
Eye strain.
The single thing you hear in China and India most, parents object.
Exactly, yeah, I know that.
But, you know, people in Singapore had, all the kids were wearing glasses before the computer scene. I mean, any sort of close work will cause that. So, you know, how do you combat it? You know, most of these things, it has to be sort of an educational thing. But I'll tell you, the one thing that really convinced me was my kid at age 3 playing Civilization 2 or 3, I forget what was out then. And, you know, he was only like 3 or 4 years old, and he comes back and he's talking about all these obscure military tactics and, you know, ancient, you know, military units and how to establish trade routes and, you know, managing economies of cities. And I'm thinking, you know, I could never have gotten him that in a school.
I think somehow maybe doing some big advertisement. I mean,
yeah.
Scientifically there is, you know, no correlation between, you know, the problems.
There's also a huge problem in Japan. There was a book called Game Brain that was written that literally a sort of self-appointed psychologist wrote and said that kids are developing a disease he labeled game brain from playing games. And the industry's trying to push back on that. So there actually has been very concerted effort within certain, I mean, just Asian culture, Asian communities that sort of like, where they put out these sort of almost marketing-laced anti-gaming messages, not really based on the violence aspect, although there's been some issues with exhaustion in China and Korea, and some others. So, I mean, you know, it's man bites dog.
I will say this, that one of the challenges we have as a scientific community is every time there's an issue we want, like a public perception issue, we always want to address it by giving them better facts. Gee, if only there was a good study that proved this. That doesn't sway anybody's opinion in the popular. It will for decision makers, for leaders, for people who are well educated, but for the masses, you need a marketing-laced pitch. You need, you know, here's Johnny, you know, he loves his computer, you know, he's learned so much. You can't go the fact-based route.
Some publishing some scientific studies following certain children to see comparing, or some control study. I think that would be much more convincing for.
Well, it's convincing. Well, there's a fair amount of marketing research that shows that kind of thing is convincing for people like us. It's not really. As soon as my mother-in-law gets the book that hypes that your vision will go bad and your brain will go crazy by some guy who's got a PhD in parapsychology, she's going to believe him over my scientific study. So, yeah.
Kind of growing up in the 50s, we kind of ran into the same sort of thing. You know, oh my God, we don't know anything about science and technology. We better educate our students. And so, if things were kind of low then, did they kind of get better for a while and then get worse? Or did they always be crappy until now, or what?
That's a good question, and to some extent I can't really answer it, certainly with the data here, because the international comparisons weren't around in the 50s. So in the 50s you're probably comparing against what? Well, Sputnik.
International. I mean, you know,
yeah, but there was...
we can't, you know, oh my God. You know.
Yeah, but that was sort of a one... I'm not sure that the data back then was...
Well, there was a whole lot of initiatives about we've got to do something.
Well, there was certainly the whole Sputnik era was a whole bunch of...
The GI Bill was also kicking in then too. So
yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, you know, did that work? And then we got...
Well, certainly in terms of producing numbers, it absolutely worked. Okay, the whole Sputnik initiative thing, that absolutely worked. If you look at the scientists and engineers today who are populating the federal workforce, almost all of those were Sputnik era people. So in terms of producing large numbers of people, motivating large numbers of people, but your original question I thought was sort of the quality of the education system, and that I'm not sure I would have good enough data to address, but the numbers issue was clearly addressed by that.
So the pressing need to end World War II created the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. The Russian competitiveness in space drove the Kennedy to, in '62, say we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That was a big challenge.
Yeah.
What we lack is a clearly articulated big challenge today. In other words, the story.
Yeah.
That will motivate everyone.
That is a huge story, and to do it right, you need something that's a big fear combined with a big opportunity. That's always the best pairing. And so, to some extent, this outsourcing, offshoring sort of gave, you know, the fear sense, and then you kind of had the opportunity sense, but it wasn't as sustained a fear as the Sputnik, as the whatever. People are already kind of getting used to the, okay, well, I can just go to India and get a job there kind of approach. But you're right. You're absolutely right. That's what is needed. But I will say that that is sort of peculiar to our country and our psyche and our culture, that we make decisions in that way, that we need the fear and the opportunity combined in order to get our legislature and our people to act. You know, you look at other countries that are centrally driven like China. They don't need that. You look at countries like Japan, which decided once they went through a couple of oil shocks that they weren't going to have an economy based on petroleum anymore, and that was just going to be the end of it. And they just successfully moved to nuclear. I think it's a cultural thing with us, sort of uniquely. Or maybe also Western Europe, I don't know. I don't know if you have a sense of that.
I haven't studied that part very much, but the cultures you refer to in Japan and China are, well, I mean, the
very different.
Chinese is very regimented in terms of, although it's top down.
Yeah.
In Japan, though, it's actually cultural in the sense that when people are exhorted by leaders to go do this,
they do.
Go sign up.
This is more conformist.
They'll do the next day,
yeah.
or at least within the week.
Yeah.
And because there's a lot more trust there between the layers of society.
Yeah, we just don't have either of those cultures here, and so we're left. Yeah. Yes.
So both the workforce and games to learn are very interesting issues that don't necessarily have to be.
That's true.
Although it may be very effective to have that fear factor, as you say. Games are tremendously expensive to produce and very difficult to do well. It's a hits business. For every X number of games that are successful, there are hundreds more, and so the cost, the difficulty, and the creativity actually required to make a good game, even just for entertainment purposes, is quite difficult. We don't make money on them yet, and so.
So how would
I'm a complete believer. You're preaching to the converted, and yet there's this tremendous problem, I think, of a way to do it in a
economically sensible business model
for a completely fragmented market without, for example, one question that often occurs to me, it's not clear to me that the entire population learns well through games. Most of our examples are in areas where there's a predilection for them already because of the people involved in doing work in the research.
Well, I would say that question is actually not researched enough to even know what percentage of the population really learns better. But let me just say that the business model hasn't been developed. That's a key issue that the community needs to work on. However, when you're talking about an entertainment game...
This is specifically true for learning games.
Yes.
Not for other uses of games outside of
it. That is true. That is true. So games for professional training, like teaching workers things for a company, that's well paid for and understood. Yeah. But there are some considerations. One is that unlike entertainment games where you're competing against other forms of entertainment media, with an educational game, often you're competing against something that's a pretty sorry substitute at a pretty high price point, like a textbook. So I could spend $50 for my engineering textbook, or I could spend $50 for a game. If somebody told me I could make an A on the test with the game and only get a C on the test with the textbook, I know which one I would buy. So
are you proposing to replace a course in the university with a game? I'm not really clear about the whole relationship.
It can be anywhere in the spectrum. It can be anywhere in the spectrum. So there are situations in which it makes sense for teachers to take little snippets of games and incorporate them into classroom demonstrations. There are situations where it makes sense to have this a completely outside the classroom experience for students to learn and get enthused about some subject matter that then propel them to be interested in it in school. There are situations in which, quite frankly, my professor never showed up, never gave a lecture I understood, and if I just had the game and could work on it at home in college, maybe that was the better way to go. So I think the field is developing with an entire spectrum of little add-ons to existing courses all the way to the full-blown replacement for a couple of chapters out of a textbook. It's everywhere in there. And we don't really even have the information to let us know what is the best approach yet. Back in the back?
The researchers doing, investigating possible side effects of integrating the game, such as students who raise their expectations for how compelling coursework should be. And
that happened already, actually. That happened even without games. I mean, the digital generation kind of like, you call this a graphic? I mean, even illustrations and textbooks are kind of...
Great paper Amy Bruckman's team at Georgia Tech did on a project called Aquamoose that you can find on the web, and it talks about a game project gone wrong based on expectations set too high, and what the side effects and the ultimate demise, dismal result were.
So let's welcome Ben Sawyer. Thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. I think you can. So my talk today is basically just titled Serious Games 2.0. This is sort of not necessarily meaning this is the second coming of serious games as much as this is sort of the second great roundup of sort of information and kind of definition of the space and what we're talking about, and sort of second round of evangelization of what is going on. One kid said this was worse than math class. Their expectations were so Aquamoose. This was a project that they tried to create a sort of game-like environment to teach math. They just did such a bad job. They said to the kids, tomorrow we're bringing a game. And they did not set any further expectation.
And so kids expected, you know, AAA title game. But you don't actually need that level of resolution gameplay to get the learning across, yeah.
A couple announcements. We're going to break after this and go in the cafeteria, so if anybody has any questions they'd like to follow up, we'll be in a booth drinking coffee. Tomorrow, Ben Sawyer will be presenting at the same time. Ben's with the Serious Games Initiative, and he'll be doing a very complimentary talk. And I was looking for somebody from LCA. There's nobody from LCA in here, is there? Okay, but I'd certainly like to meet you all, so if you want to introduce yourself to me. This is an initiative I'm running in Microsoft Research, and I'd love to chat with you about it. This is an initiative I'm running in Microsoft Research, and I'd love to chat with you about it.
Thank you very much.